Holly Wilbert. I live in Salem, Massachusetts, and just as a
I'm sorry, what is your name again?
It's Holly Wilbert, and I live in
Holly.
Salem, Massachusetts. Maybe I should have said a small city on the North Shore, but you talk about the redistribution of wealth, and I must admit from my personal experience as an engaged city dweller for 30 years, that we have received massive amounts of federal money, significant amounts of federal money, to no good end over the last 30 years, to not enough good end. So to that point, I'm very concerned about how a redistribution would occur successfully. Because I've seen a lot of money not make a lot of difference, and we recently had the schools in Salem decline to a very bad rating at that point. The countries in Europe that have successfully redistributed to therefore implied redistribution to improve the mobility, aren't those sort of suspect in the sense that they're sort of North Sea oil, smaller populations, able to more successfully do that as opposed to a country like the United States, which is so much larger and where the problem is so much more complex to be able to pull off?
Well, I guess I would perhaps make a distinction between, I was suggesting redistribution, particularly from the point of view of reducing inequality, but I did make that comparison to, and they were mostly Northern Europe, that had much higher intergenerational mobility than the U.S. But I'm not sure that. I'm not sure that the redistribution issue is so much of an issue. That is, they do have, those economies are fairly homogeneous. They don't have as much inequality as we do. So again, it's easier to move in some sense when there's not that much difference between the rich and the poor, but it's also, you don't care as much about it. But in fact, of course, as I show those data, they were more mobile. And they do have a bigger public sector that is making sure that the safety net is there, making sure that the poor are not terribly poor, et cetera. So I'm not sure that answers your question. Because part of your question, I think, had more to do with how federal dollars in the U.S. get distributed to towns like cities like Salem.
It's not how, it's how successfully you use those funds to make the impact that then will make the mobility more viable.
Let me take a crack at all parts of your question, Colin. I absolutely agree with Kathy that, because I've traveled in all those countries that she had there, that these are fairly homogeneous populations. Much of our inequality is because of racial and ethnic differences, and we're just so much more diverse. It's not size, it's diversity. Number two, as Kathy rightly pointed out, if you have a very small, relatively small gap between the lowest fifth and the top fifth, you don't have to move very far to go from 5 to 4 to 3. If it's a huge difference, moving from 5 to 4 is much more difficult. So you'd expect those numbers. And maybe those comparisons are therefore not perfectly, they're not as useful as they might be. What concerns me, therefore, is not simply that we're moving from, that we're less equal than Scandinavia, but that the inequality is rising over time and the mobility is going down over time. And by the way, Kathy and I did not compare notes before this, but they seem to fit so perfectly to tell that dual story. Because we normally talk about inequality, we don't talk that much about mobility, but the combination of what you saw on the inequality slides, part 1, and you saw in the mobility slides, part 2, tell a shocking story. So I think that is. The thing about how we're spending our money, we have a problem that when things are bad, like they are in the economy now, it's very hard to kind of measure the net impact of doing something. The most important in this election, which I'm sure will be touched upon tonight, is whether the stimulus that was put into effect by the Obama administration in the face of the worst recession since the Depression, the Republicans have said, and I wouldn't be surprised at all to hear Mr. Romney say, did no good. Well, that's not really true. The stimulus has still left us with an 8.1% unemployment rate, still left us with tens of millions of people, more than 10 million people unemployed. But what would the unemployment rate have been without that stimulus? And that's the hard thing to know. People have made calculations of it. It is interesting that the stimulus has at least given us enough new jobs to replace all the jobs that were lost on Obama's watch. We just haven't replaced the jobs that we lost on Mr. Bush's watch. Well, similarly here, it's hard to tell what would have happened in the absence of that government spending. It is very clear that the war on poverty succeeded, as long as we were fighting that war. Unemployment came down. By the end of the 60s, we had unemployment rates of under 4% for 4 years in a row. Inequality declined at the same time the economy grew very rapidly, and a lot of it had to do with government policy. Whether we have the appropriate set of public policies today, particularly after an era of governments that weren't always that excited about doing something about inequality, it's not surprising that we have dysfunctional programs. But still, I would say, even with the dysfunction, things could be much worse than they would have been if we hadn't spent some of that money. We spent it maybe not as effectively or efficiently as we should, and we always have to pay attention to that. But I worry about what we would have done if we had not tried to do that.
Yes, I would just mention one other. Can I just mention one other thing? Partly, John noticed that I had another slide in my pack, which I was not planning to talk about, but I put it up there because other people have. So this is a slide that just compares across countries, a larger number of countries, including countries that are not as advanced or economically developed or whatever as the original set that I was showing in that other chart. But this is actually a chart that the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Alan Krueger, showed in a talk that he gave in January. And he actually called this the Great Gatsby curve, which I think I put up there. But so it's comparing the level of inequality, that's on the horizontal axis, with intergenerational mobility across countries. And the basic argument he was making is that this upward sloping line is a bad thing. And it's what Barry and I have been talking about here. That is to say that greater inequality is associated, again, across countries with less mobility. And he also drew a conclusion which people have argued with, and I'm not sure how that in the future we would be, the U.S. would be experiencing even greater inequality because of how high how low the mobility is, that is how high the immobility is.
My name is Phil Moss. I teach at UMass Lowell, and first of all, I just want to say how satisfying it is to hear interesting information from friends and wives. And
Wives?
The point I wanted to make was I wanted to add one more suspect to your list, and I think it was shown by what I still think, and when I teach, one of the most useful didactic slides that you showed, and that is the income and productivity divide. And so when I was in graduate school, we called what you guys have been talking about the size distribution of income, and then it was the functional distribution of income, which was the division of income between labor and profits, or labor and capital. And that has greatly switched. And the people whose income is derived from profits are high-income people, and the people who derive their income from earnings are lower than that. So economists tend to look for market forces or whatever. This is politics and power. And so the bargain that was struck in 1948 with the United Auto Workers and General Motors to follow wages to follow productivity was broken in the 70s and certainly in the 80s. And so the notion of fairness and how the growth would be divided is also belongs, I think, on your list.
Right. Dr. Moss is absolutely right, and one of the suspects I had there was de-unionization. The agreement that Phil was talking about was the famous 1948 contract between General Motors Corporation and the UAW, which was also known by Fortune magazine as the Treaty of Detroit. And it set the whole new context for collective bargaining, which would ultimately affect directly about 36% of the workforce. And if you think there were other companies that were non-union that adopted the same thing, probably 3/4 of the workforce. And it had a number of parts to it, but one was that workers should share in the increased productivity of the country. And what that was called in that contract was the annual improvement factor. And workers got the annual improvement factor in their 3-year contract, which was to say that average wages or typical wage would go up not by reason of what GM's profits were or its sales, but they would go up by reason of the increased productivity as measured by the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. What was interesting about that is I always assumed that that idea of the annual improvement factor tied to productivity was put on the table by Walter Reuther, the great and famous president of the UAW. It wasn't. It was put on the table by the president of the General Motors Corporation. And the reason for it is that the president of the General Motors Corporation didn't have a great love for the union, but the thing that he really hated was higgling and haggling over wages. He said, wouldn't it be better if we had a scientific principle for setting wages? And wouldn't it be good that we could figure out how much we should give you by reason of a single long-distance telephone call from Detroit to Washington's Bureau of Labor Statistics, and we would simply ask them, what was the average increase in labor productivity in the manufacturing sector over the last 3 years? And that's what we'll put on the table, and indeed that's exactly what the UAW accepted. That spread from GM to Ford and Chrysler, the steel industry, to all the major industries, and it was even picked up by non-union companies as a fair way of setting wages. And thus, wages and incomes generally rose, including benefits, rose by about the same thing as productivity. And there's good economic analysis to explain why that's precisely the right distribution. Beginning in the 1970s, that broke down in part as labor unions become weaker, as international competition forces that widening gap, and we've never returned to that annual improvement factor or the Great Treaty of Detroit of 1948. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Sean Collins. I graduated a couple months ago with a business degree from Northeastern. I thought that one of the graphs that was most telling that you put up was the year-over-year increase in wages for all of the different segments of earners in the country, from comparing from 45 to 79 and from 79 onward, and how it was 2% in the first group, and it's changed dramatically for that second group. And so I apologize if this ends up becoming an exercise in semantics, but when we talk about redistribution of and we talk about earning power of workers in the country, it seems to me that from that graph that you presented that as far as wages increasing year over year, wealth was distributed before, and it's redistributed now in favor of people who have higher earning power, people who earn more. It seems like it's been skewed in the second half, or in the last quarter of the century, whereas before it was a whole lot more equal. So when people say, we need to figure out a way to redistribute, it seems like what we really need to do is get rid of the way it's being distributed now, which is skewed. So again, I'm sorry, I might be just mincing words, but that seems to be one of the messages. I don't know if that's the right question, but
yeah, Barry can, I don't remember the specific chart, but there certainly has been, a number of people have pointed out that, yes, and that was the point of Barry's chart, was things, the way the market perhaps worked then, earlier, until 79, was distributing things fairly, and that since 79, it has not been. But I think we have to ask how much of that is the market and how much of that is policy. So for instance, tax rates have become less progressive. Therefore, that is to say, the rich have been paying lower tax rates, certainly over the last 20 years, than was the case. I mean, it's happened just since the Clinton administration, but come down even more before that. So I guess I would, I mean, I think from the policy point of view, we want to think about what goes into those differential growth rates. I'm sure you can.
One way to think about what Kathy and I have been talking about is think about the pre-tax transfer distribution of income before we do anything to move money around based on government taxes or transfer programs, and then the post-tax and transfer. Kathy suggested that one way that we can deal with this is if we can't affect the pre-tax distribution of income, that's the productivity versus wages, that's all of my Hercule Poirot suspects, then at least try and do something after the market distributes wages and incomes. And you do that through two things. One, or several things, but these are the most important ones. An overall system of taxation which is progressive, as Kathy said, which is to say that the richer you are, the higher the tax rate you should pay. Right? Romney should not get away with 13% or 9% or whatever he paid if you are paying 26%. There's something fundamentally wrong with that. And it's fundamentally wrong, it seems to me, and I get some capital gains income every year, I used to, that I get taxed heavier on the work I do here at the university than I do sitting around waiting for my stock to go up. Something crazy about that, but we do that here. So that's one way you do that. And in fact, you have to think about your stuff, the income tax, but you have to think about the whole tax system complete. So it includes Social Security taxes, Medicare taxes, the state sales tax you pay, the state income tax in this state, you know, excise taxes on your own. You have to add them all together and see what kind of system you get. And the system we have in this country, at best, is proportional. That rich people, no matter how much income they have, are paying a tax rate no higher than low-income people. Even if those low-income people pay no federal income tax at all, because they're taxed in so many other ways. And the reason for a progressive income tax is very simple. There's a simple economics of it. And that is, we should tax people on the basis of the marginal utility of money that they get from an extra dollar. So when we give an extra dollar to somebody who already has $1 billion of them, it doesn't really add much to their utility. When you add that money to somebody who needs that for food, it's very powerful. Similarly, if you take $1 away from that billionaire, it really doesn't affect their standard of living very much. But if you take that $1 away from somebody who has very little money, it's a massive impact. And so simple economics of marginal utility would suggest a progressive system maximizes social utility. You know, then you have the expenditure side of the budget. And the question is, to what extent do you redistribute opportunity by having government spending which provides programs, as Polly was suggesting, that really help people at the bottom, right? So help with education, help with job training, helping to pay for higher education if you can make it here, and so forth are ways of doing that. Unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, all of those. If you have a government that wants to slash those programs and at the same time reduce taxes, particularly on the rich, the after-tax distribution of income under such a program is going to become even worse than it is today. I hope Mr. Obama may raise that issue in the debate tonight. But that's the kind of society we have. But there are many tools we have to deal with that. We just don't tend to use them the way we used to.
And I guess one other thing I would say is just that I think the research does show that much of the increase in inequality has been on the pre-tax side, that is the pre-government side, before taxes and transfers. So it is that market distribution of income which has become much more unequal. As Barry just said, we're often not, if we're not going to attack those suspects, I mean his suspects were mostly on the market side, then we do want to think about the tax and transfer side.
Hi. My question is more on...
Who are you?
expound on this for me. I thought about it when you came up with your murder on the Inequality Express, when you talked about deregulation. And I know that there was the STAGall Act that kind of kept banking from kind of investing in itself and with other institutions. And it seemed like it was very easy for that to be repealed in the early 80s. And is there any way with these new administrations coming in where those could be made more ironclad? Because that was made a huge difference on our economy and as a result affecting poor people. So can you just talk about that a little bit?
I think you're referring to the GlassSteagall Act, which came out during the Great Depression when we had a bank failure. And the idea was to separate the kind of commercial banks that take in deposits from you and me and loan them out to local businesses and things like that, from investment banks that make often risky, speculative investments in all kinds of things like derivatives and mortgage-backed securities secured by adjustable rate mortgages. We divided those, and we said that commercial banks can't do those kinds of things. That was eroded over time, and finally it was completely repealed under the right-wing radical government of Bill Clinton, under Bob Rubin, and under Larry Summers, as a matter of fact. We are now trying to restructure some of that through the so-called Dodd-Frank bill. Barney Frank, who was actually with us last week at the back of the room, or 2 weeks ago, that is a mammoth, thousands of pages of regulations to try and re-regulate the banking industry. I would argue that the collapse of the banking institutions affected the rich and the poor in very different ways. For some rich people, they lost a lot of money who had invested in these derivatives and so forth. But poor people and middle-income people lost a lot more because of the decline in the value of their homes as a result of the collapse in the housing market. And that is linked to what happened in the banking sector. So I think you're absolutely right.
Sorry, your wealth numbers that you showed.
Right,
actually.
the wealth numbers, the collapse of black wealth in half in 3 years is mostly a housing collapse. And what we know from our own Greater Boston Housing Report Cards that we do here at the Dukakis Center, that through the mortgage practices, many of which were rather dubious, low-income families were able to get into the housing market between 2000 and 2006, 2007. They were often in neighborhoods and communities where prices exploded and they were paying way too much for housing on mortgages that they couldn't service. And that's precisely in those neighborhoods where prices have fallen the most. And those are the folks who faced foreclosure as a result of it. And so for many of these families, whatever wealth they had disappeared, not by 50%, by 100%.
Hi there, I'm Sonia Chang-Diaz. I don't know if you're a co-conveners for this class. Hello, dental students.
And what's your day job?
Right, I represent where we are right now in the State Senate, the 2nd Suffolk District here in Boston. Thanks for reminding me. And my question, I just wanted to loop back to 2 questions back about sort of what caused that broad distribution of wealth in the earlier segment of years, in this question of pre-tax and transfer and post-tax and transfer. And it seems to me that there's a sort of gray area in between there of things that are policy choices but don't necessarily get classified as tax policy or transfers of wealth, but that might be contributing factors. And I'm just wondering, and I don't honestly know the answer. I'm wondering if you know of trends in one direction or the other that might explain that change in a category that I might call infrastructure investments. We don't consider investments in K-12 education as a transfer of wealth, I assume, or for example, investments in public transportation infrastructure. But those are things that fundamentally affect individuals' ability to access, both mobility and change their quality situation. So I'm just wondering if there's a trend there.
Yep. I'll take a crack and maybe Kathy has this. First of all, when we look at that period of time of very rapid economic growth, 1947 to 1979, 104%, doubling of family incomes, and growing equality. What was going on? Well, after World War II in 1947, immediately after the war, we had a whole lot of things to help build America's middle class. We didn't have a middle class, really, before World War II, before the Great Depression. And I define a middle class as a class of families who have moderate incomes that allow them to cover their needs and who have a feeling that that income is relatively secure. What did it? Well, one we already covered. It was unionization. Workers got higher incomes, and more importantly, they got a lot of stability in those incomes. They got all kinds of benefits, health benefits, life insurance, all kinds of things like that. The second thing is that we actually had a whole bunch of government policies that supported a middle-class lifestyle. The GI Bill, it made it possible for millions of returning GIs to go to college. Their family had never had the opportunity to do that before. It allowed them to get into the housing market with GI VA loans, Veterans Administration loans. And over that period of time of the baby boom generation, those housing values soared. That's why I'm a rich man today. I bought at the right time, a generation ago, and I saw my very first home, which was in Newton Highlands. Anybody from Newton here? I bought my house, my first house, which was in Manchester Road off of Walnut. I was ripped off, 2-bedroom, 1.5 bath little cottage on a corner lot, and I had to pay $47,000 for it. I sold it 10 years later for $207,000, right? Made me a rich man. Lots of people were able to do that, and in fact, the much maligned, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac actually played a tremendous role in providing enormous amounts of mortgage capital so that the private banking system could loan mortgages out at reasonably low rates that allowed people to build up their housing values. And for the typical American, the housing value they have is 80 to 90% or more of their total wealth. We no longer are supporting that. We no longer have anything like the GI Bill. We no longer have, for low-income people, AFDC, the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program. We have cut back on programs investing in our schools. And the sad part is, and you know it as well as other members of the House and Senate in this room, that we're going to be facing very tough fiscal times for many years to come, unless we can somehow increase our revenues, which seem difficult to do in this era. And that means even the programs we have today may be weakened, which I fear will make it even more difficult to reverse the trends, and particularly the trends that Kathy talked about.
I guess I would just mention one. I think it's only a small example, but you were asking about other policies that may have reinforced these trends. I mean, I think one thing is protection of workers and their ability to unionize. That if we compare today and what say the National Labor Relations Board or whatever, the way policies come down today with 40 years ago, 30 years ago, even 20 years ago, it is much harder for workers to unionize. So that's not even infrastructure, but it is the institutions, in which in which the economy is operating.
Julia Geisman, I'm a learning and organizational development consultant. So Barry, I wanted to key off of what you just said, which was reversing the trend of what is currently happening. I'd like to know, in the doom and gloom perspective, what's the implication of not reversing it, of it continuing in the direction that it is continuing? Because I mean, I appreciate all the statistics, but I'm not sure anybody can really understand the criticality of reversing the trend.
Well, somebody here who's been coming quite often asked me to just mention something we actually discussed a couple open classroom semesters ago. And it's some terrific work done by a couple people in England. And they wrote a book called The Spirit Level. I think some of you may know about it, but what they did, they're epidemiologists, they're not economists. Frank Wilkinson. And what they did was to look across countries and compare the income distributions in every country with a whole bunch of social factors, from obesity to depression to suicide rates to murder rates, you name it. And one of the things they found over and over and over again is the more unequal the distribution of income, the more the social dysfunction. And when Wilkinson was here, he and I were in several conferences. We did a whole program for WBUR, on point and so forth. And one of the questions that Tom Ashbrook asked is, he says, I can certainly understand why great inequality hurts low-income people, the people at the low end. But why should it also affect people at the high end? Which Wilkinson found. And my answer was, think about two societies. Sweden, which has that very narrow income distribution, and the United States, which has this big, high distribution. You certainly can understand why poor people would be more depressed, more sick, more susceptible to all kinds of social dysfunction. Why about rich people? Well, think of it this way. If you're in Sweden and you fall out of the top, you don't fall very far. You break an ankle, metaphorically. In the United States, if you fall out of the top and keep falling, you break your neck. So what do? You do all those kinds of things to try and secure your position in the top. You give millions and millions of dollars to the Romney-Ryan campaign. Number two, you work to make sure that the laws will support you and maintain your wealth. And you do that through Citizens United. Number three, possibly if you fear that you're going to be harmed, you'll cut corners and maybe cheat around the edges, and we catch some of you and throw you in jail for fraud and for embezzlement and for what you did with the derivatives market, but not that many people. You are certainly stressed out because you're working harder to try and stay on the top, and so you're spending more time at work, less time with family, and all the other things. And so it's not surprising that if you have this tremendous inequality, it's not just going to be the poor who are going to suffer, it's going to be all of society. And then ultimately what happens when you get a society in which the distance, the social distance between the rich and the poor get further and further apart? Where very few of us ever spend any time on Geneva Avenue or Bowden Street. And we're spending time in Chestnut Hill. What happens is we stop caring. And at some point it gets so bad that you get real class warfare. Not just a bunch of well-meaning kids, you know, in a square in downtown Boston, but more and more people saying the system's unfair. And you get kind of the Arab Spring in the US.
Actually, that was my husband.
I think this has to be the last question.
Hi, my name is Robin Black. I'm a recent graduate of the Urban Regional Policy Master's Program here, and now I work at Mass DOT in the Real Estate and Asset Development Department there. I was just wondering if...
Nice to know you still have assets.
I was just wondering if there was data available in line with what you both presented, showing geographical or state, by state, to see if there's any bright spots, or to see if different economies or local economies had different results, or state policies had different results, just to see if there was any bright spots.
Yeah. I think the answer is there is, and I'm pretty sure there's some of those data in the State of Working America 2012 edition. If not in that one, in one of the former editions that looks at it by region, by state, and so forth. And there are some states that are more equal than others. I don't have the data in front of me, but you could find those data. Well, I want to thank all of you, and particularly next week. Do we have it? Graham Allison.
We're running a public service announcement here.
What? Oh, good. But I just want to tell you who we have next week as we switch gears from kind of domestic policy to looking at the whole question of foreign policy. And we have with us two unbelievably phenomenal people who you absolutely want to see. Bring all your friends, come early, or you'll be sitting on the stairs again. We have Graham Allison from the Kennedy School. We have Julia Kayam, formerly of Homeland Security, now op-ed editor, or op-ed correspondent for the Boston Globe, and also a lecturer at Harvard University. We're going to be looking at the whole question of foreign policy, Homeland Security. I'm sure we'll get into Iran, Iraq, Libya, Syria, you name it. Come next week, we'll see you then. Have a good week.